I was the only person who cared for my wife's sick father in his final days. After my wife and her sisters dumped him and left at his will reading, my wife and her sisters got his multi-million business. I got the rundown farmhouse. My wife mocked me. Should have taken better care of him. Then the lawyer said, actually. My wife went white at what came next. Look, I'm not saying my wife's family is heartless, but when my father-in-law, Richard Hawthorne, got diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, they disappeared faster than my paycheck after bills are due. I mean, we're talking Olympic-level ghosting here. Usain Bolt couldn't have bolted that quick. My wife Melissa, bless her designer handbag-loving heart, sat me down in our kitchen the day after Richard's doctor delivered the news and said with a completely straight face, Travis, I just can't handle hospitals emotionally. The smell of antiseptic makes me nauseous, and watching someone deteriorate is too traumatic for my mental health. She said this while scrolling through Instagram, double-tapping photos of someone's vacation in Santorini. Real broken up about it. You know, her therapist had apparently greenlit this level of avoidance, which I'm pretty sure isn't how therapy is supposed to work. But hey, I'm just the guy who married into this circus. Her sisters were even better. Tiffany, the middle child who works in brand consulting, which as far as I can tell means she takes selfies and calls it market research, suddenly discovered an urgent work trip to Austin that absolutely could not be rescheduled. It's a major client, Travis. She explained over speakerphone, her voice dripping with fake regret. They're launching a new athleisure line. And I'm the only one who understands their vision, right? Because what dying father wouldn't understand that yoga pants wait for no man? Lauren, the youngest and definitely the most dramatic, claims she had to go to Seattle for 6 months for a digital nomad intensive retreat that cost more than my truck. When I asked what exactly you intensively retreat from for half a year, she got all huffy and said I wouldn't understand the millennial struggle for authentic self-discovery. She's 34. The millennial excuse is getting pretty worn out. Lauren, so that left me. Travis Donovan, the son-in-law everyone had spent the last 8 years calling Mr. Average at family gatherings, usually right before asking if I could fix their garbage disposal or hang some shelves. I'm a contractor, which in the Hawthorne family hierarchy ranks somewhere between the gardener and that weird cousin nobody invites to weddings. Richard himself had spent years introducing me as the handyman with no ambition. Usually, while wearing a smirk that suggested he found my entire existence mildly amusing at best. But here's the thing about people vanishing. When stuff gets real, somebody's got to stay. And apparently that somebody was me. The first week was brutal, not going to lie. Richard had moved into hospice care at his massive house in the suburbs, the kind of place with more bathrooms than I have friends. The nurses would come by twice a day, but the rest of the time, that was all me, baby. Feeding him soup that he'd complained tasted like dishwater that gave up on life. Helping him to the bathroom, which let me tell you, does wonders for any illusions you had about dignity. Adjusting his oxygen tanks while he barked orders like a retired general who'd never quite accepted retirement. Not that tube, the other one. He'd wheeze. Did you even read the manual or are you just winging it like you wing everything else? I'm winging it with style, Richard. I'd shoot back. That's the Travis Donovan guarantee. He'd grunt, which I learned was his version of a laugh. The house felt like a mausoleum most days. 2,300 square feet of marble floors and uncomfortable furniture that looked expensive, but felt like sitting on decorative rocks. Melissa would call maybe twice a week, always during her lunch break, always sounding distracted. How's Dad doing? She'd ask. And before I could answer with anything more detailed than fine, she'd already be moving on to tell me about some drama at her Pilates class or how her Tesla needed charging. But then something weird started happening around week 3. Richard stopped being such a colossal pain in my ass. We'd watch old westerns together on his ridiculously oversized TV, the kind where John Wayne looked like he could step right out of the screen and ask for a beer. Richard knew every line from The Searchers and would whisper them along with the actors, his voice raspy but determined. During commercial breaks, he'd tell me stories about growing up poor in Oklahoma, about building his textile company from nothing, about mistakes he'd made and people he trusted who didn't deserve it. My daughters, he said one night, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. I gave them everything. Private schools, cars, college funds that could have bought small islands. You know what they learned? How to spend it. I offered. He actually smiled at that. How to expect it. There's a difference, Travis. A big one. I brought him butterscotch pudding that night because the nurses said he needed more calories and he'd complained it tasted like sweetened regret, which honestly wasn't wrong, but he ate it anyway. And we sat in comfortable silence watching Clint Eastwood squint at people for justice. The nurses, Deborah and Patricia, started calling me the good son, which made me laugh because I wasn't even a real son, just the disposable son-in-law who'd drawn the short straw. Deborah, a no-nonsense woman from Jamaica with arms that could probably bench press me, told me one afternoon while checking Richard's vitals. Most families, they run away from death like it's contagious. But you show up every day. That man notices. Trust me, honey, he notices everything. Richard's neighbor, an elderly widower named Frank, who still mowed his own lawn at 83, would wave at me when I'd arrive each morning. "You're doing a good thing, son," he'd call out. Most people these days don't know what loyalty looks like anymore. I'd wave back, wondering if loyalty was the right word or if I was just too stubborn to abandon someone everybody else had written off. Sometimes late at night when the morphine made Richard chatty and philosophical, he'd grab my wrist with surprising strength for a dying man and look at me with eyes that were still sharp despite everything. "You're the only one who shows up, kid," he'd say. His voice barely above a whisper. "Remember that? You're the only damn one." I'd nod, uncomfortable with the intensity of it, figuring it was just the drugs talking. Old man getting sentimental as the end approached. We all cope differently, right? But here's what I didn't know then. Sitting in that oversized house, watching a millionaire slowly fade away while his actual family sent occasional thoughts and prayers texts. Richard Hawthorne wasn't the kind of man who said things he didn't mean, medicated or not. And he definitely wasn't the kind of man who forgot who showed up when it mattered and who didn't. Turns out the old man had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. And I was about to become his checkmate. Richard died on a Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. right when I was in his kitchen microwaving chicken noodle soup because he'd complained the night before that everything tasted like cardboard. And Campbell was apparently the only thing that still had a soul. I heard the monitor alarm from upstairs, that long flat beep that sounds exactly like what you'd imagine the end sounds like. And I knew before I even climbed those stairs that the old man was gone. Deborah, the night nurse, was already there checking for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. Her face professional but sad. "He went peacefully," she told me, her hand on my shoulder in his sleep. "That's a blessing, honey." I nodded, staring at Richard's face, which looked weirdly younger without all that pain carved into it. He looked like he'd finally won an argument nobody else knew he was having. I called Melissa at 7:02 a.m. 15 minutes felt like the appropriate amount of time to sit with death before dealing with the living, you know. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice thick with sleep and irritation. "Travis, it's 700 in the morning. What's wrong?" "Your dad passed away," I said quietly about 20 minutes ago peacefully in his sleep. There was a pause. Not the kind of pause where someone's processing grief or shock. More like the pause you take when you're calculating something. Then she said, and I swear on everything I own this is verbatim. "Oh, okay. I'll call Tiffany and Lauren. We need to get ready because this means the company's ours now." Not, "Oh my God." Not, "I'll be right there." Not even a single sob or sharp intake of breath. Just immediate business mode. Like her father's death was an email notification about a stock dividend. "Melissa," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Your dad just died. Maybe we could have I don't know, 5 minutes of being human before we talk about corporate structure." "Don't be dramatic, Travis." She snapped suddenly wide awake. "This is how adult business families handle things. We grieve, yes, but we also have to think practically. Dad would have wanted us to be smart about this, right? Richard would have definitely wanted his death to be treated like a hostile takeover opportunity. Totally his vibe." She arrived 2 hours later in a black Chanel suit that looked suspiciously fresh off the rack. Her makeup perfect, her hair blown out like she was attending a red carpet event for grief. Tiffany and Lauren showed up within the hour. Both of them wearing designer sunglasses indoors like they were celebrities dodging paparazzi instead of daughters who'd ignored their father for 6 months while he rotted away. They hugged each other in the foyer. This weird group hug that looked rehearsed. And I swear I heard Tiffany whisper "finally free." Lauren was already on her phone probably texting her followers about this difficult time with some filtered selfie where she looked beautifully tragic. The funeral planning was something else entirely. We're talking Shark Tank Funeral Edition, except the product being pitched was their fake grief, and the investors were anyone who might judge them for being terrible daughters. Melissa took charge immediately, booking the most expensive funeral home in the county, the kind of place with fountains in the lobby, and staff who spoke in hushed tones like they were working at a luxury spa for the dead. "We need it to reflect Dad's status," Melissa announced at the planning meeting. Sitting across from a funeral director named Craig who had the kind of beard that screamed, "I take our Teasel coffee very seriously." He was a pillar of the business community. "This needs to be memorable." "Memorable like he was or memorable like a LinkedIn post," I muttered. But nobody heard me because Tiffany was already debating flower arrangements like she was competing on a reality show. White roses are so predictable, Tiffany said, flipping through a catalog. What about orchids? They're more sophisticated, more dad. Lauren looked up from her phone. Can we do a digital memorial wall where people can post photos like interactive? I could live stream parts of it for people who can't make it. I stared at her. You want to live stream your father's funeral? It's called being inclusive, Travis. She shot back. Not everyone can travel. This way, his legacy reaches more people. It's what the modern grieving process looks like. The modern grieving process apparently also included Tiffany wearing a white suit to the funeral because, as she explained to anyone who'd listen, white is a symbol of purity and new beginnings in many cultures. I read about it in a Goop article. It felt right. She looked like she was either attending a very confused wedding or auditioning for a cult. I half expected her to start handing out cleansing crystals. The funeral itself was held on a Saturday at St. Michael's Episcopal Church, a gorgeous old building with stained glass, and enough wood paneling to make a lumberjack weep. About 200 people showed up, mostly business associates, country club friends, and people who probably owed Richard money at some point. Frank, the neighbor, sat in the back pew and gave me a knowing nod when our eyes met. Melissa gave the eulogy, walking up to the podium in heels so high I'm pretty sure they violated several physics laws. She cleared her throat, looked out at the crowd with practiced emotion, and began. My father was a complicated man. I almost laughed out loud. Complicated man is universal code for we barely spoke, but I need to sound deep and introspective right now. It's the eulogy equivalent of it's not you, it's me, she continued, her voice wavering in all the right places. He taught us the value of hard work, the importance of family, and the meaning of perseverance. 3 things she'd actively ignored her entire adult life. But sure, let's go with that narrative. He built an empire from nothing, and his legacy will live on through all of us who loved him. Tiffany dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue. Lauren was absolutely filming this on her phone. I could see the red recording light from where I sat 3 rows back. Someone's Instagram stories were about to get very morbid. When it was over, people lined up to offer condolences, shaking hands with the daughters like they'd just survived a natural disaster instead of a carefully orchestrated performance. I stood off to the side near Richard's coffin, this obscenely expensive mahogany number with gold handles that probably cost more than my yearly salary. I looked down at him, peaceful in his final suit, and remembered our last real conversation 3 days before he died. He'd grabbed my hand, his grip weak but determined, and said, "They're going to act like they loved me, Travis. They're going to cry pretty tears and say pretty words. Don't believe a damn second of it. You know who I really was. You're the only one who stayed when staying was hard." I told him to save his strength, that he shouldn't worry about any of this. But he'd shaken his head, adamant. "I'm not worried, kid. I'm prepared." Big difference. Standing there at his funeral, watching his daughters work the room like it was a networking event. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. It wasn't exactly sadness, though there was grief mixed in there somewhere. It was more like anticipation, like waiting for a punchline you know is coming but can't quite predict. Richard Hawthorne had been a lot of things. Stubborn, judgmental, brutally honest, occasionally mean. But he'd never been stupid and he'd definitely never been careless. A man who'd built a multi-million-dollar empire from Oklahoma dirt didn't just die without having every last detail figured out. And something told me watching Melissa Eyre kiss someone from the garden club that Richard's final move was going to be his masterpiece. The old man always did love a good plot twist. 3 days after we buried Richard, we all assembled at the law offices of Henderson and Blay like we were gathering for the world's most passive-aggressive book club meeting. The office was located downtown in one of those buildings that screams, "We charge by the minute." And our water costs $8 a bottle. All glass and steel and uncomfortable modern furniture that looked like it was designed by someone who hated the human spine. The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A table so polished you could see your existential crisis reflected in it and that distinct smell that expensive places have. A mixture of leather, money, and the faint desperation of people trying to prove they belong there. There were bottles of fancy water nobody would drink, and a coffee station with one of those machines that sounds like it's launching a small spacecraft every time you press a button. Melissa strutted in like she was walking a runway, wearing a black Armani dress that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd already mentally spent her inheritance 3 times over. She brought her Louis Vuitton tote bag, the one she called her power bag, which I'm pretty sure is just a regular bag that costs $4,000 and gives you an inflated sense of self-importance. Tiffany arrived 5 minutes later in head Toto Prada because apparently grief has a dress code and that code is aggressively expensive. She was carrying her iPad because she couldn't go 5 minutes without checking her brand metrics, which is what she calls obsessively monitoring how many people liked her latest post about green juice or manifesting abundance or whatever cult-adjacent wellness trend she's peddling this week. Lauren showed up last naturally wearing vintage Gucci and those ridiculous oversized sunglasses that make people look like fashionable insects. She immediately started setting up her phone on a little tripod because God forbid she experience a major life moment without documenting it for her 12,000 followers who definitely cared deeply about her inheritance drama. "Lauren, you cannot film this," Melissa hissed, her smile tight. "It's a legal proceeding." "It's my truth, Melissa," Lauren replied, not looking up from adjusting her ring light. "My followers have been on this journey with me. They deserve closure, too." "Your followers don't deserve," I said, dropping into a chair at the far end of the table. "They're strangers on the internet who watch you eat salads and complain about flight delays." She finally looked at me, her expression wounded in that performative way influencers have perfected. "You wouldn't understand the responsibility of having a platform, Travis." "You're right," I said. "I'm too busy living in reality to understand pretend responsibility." Mr. Henderson walked in before Lauren could fire back, saving us all from what I'm sure would have been a riveting debate about authentic engagement and algorithmic reach. Charles Henderson was about 65 with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that had seen every family fight imaginable and stopped being surprised by human awfulness sometime during the Reagan administration. He was carrying a leather folder that looked older than me and had the weight of someone about to referee a cage match disguised as estate planning. "Ladies, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone lawyers use when they're professionally required to pretend everyone in the room is civilized. "Thank you for coming. I know this is a difficult time." Melissa literally couldn't help herself. "Let's just get to it, Charles. We're all adults here. We know why we're gathered, right? Adults. That's definitely the word I'd use for 3 women who'd abandoned their dying father and were now practically salivating over his money like it was the last Black Friday sale at Nordstrom." Mr. Henderson sat down, opened the folder with the reverence of someone handling a historical document and pulled out Richard's will. It was typed on fancy paper with an embossed letterhead because even in death, Richard Hawthorne wasn't doing anything halfway. The lawyer cleared his throat in that dramatic way they must teach in law school. Right between how to bill in 6-minute increments and making your voice sound ominous for effect. "The last will and testament of Richard James Hawthorne." He began, and I swear the room temperature dropped 5 degrees from the collective intensity of everyone's attention. "Written on March 15th of this year and witnessed by myself and my partner Gregory Blay." March 15th. The Ides of March. Of course, Richard had updated his will on the day Julius Caesar got stabbed. The man had a flair for symbolic timing. Henderson continued reading through the standard legal jargon that sounds like English, but isn't really all they heretofore and in perpetuity. Stuff that makes you wonder if lawyers are just messing with us. Then he got to the good part, his voice taking on that slow dramatic cadence that lawyers apparently love using for plot twists. "To my daughters, Melissa and Hawthorne Donovan, Tiffany Marie Hawthorne, and Lauren Elizabeth Hawthorne, I leave controlling shares of Hawthorne Textiles Incorporated to be divided equally among the 3 of them, valued at approximately $12.6 million. Melissa actually clapped. I'm not exaggerating. She brought her hands together in genuine applause like she'd just watched a kindergarten play and wanted to encourage the performers. The sound echoed in the conference room and for a second everyone just stared at her. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. This is wonderful news. Dad really did love us." Tiffany reached over and high-fived her. An actual high-five at a reading. I was witnessing the death of decorum in real time, and honestly, I was kind of impressed by the audacity. Lauren had her phone out typing furiously, probably crafting the perfect caption about legacy and family and gratitude that would accompany whatever filtered photo she'd post later. Something like, "Forever grateful for the lessons Daddy taught us about building empires and believing in family." With 17 emojis and a link to her Amazon storefront, Mr. Henderson waited for them to finish their celebration, his face carefully neutral in that way that suggested he'd seen this exact scenario play out 100 times with 100 different terrible families. Then he continued reading and his eyes flicked toward me for just a second. "And to my son-in-law, Travis Michael Donovan, I leave the family farmhouse and surrounding property at 82 Willow Creek Road, including all structures, land, and contents therein." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a designer handbag drop. Then Melissa snorted. Not a gentle laugh, but an actual snort-laugh combo that sounded like a pig questioning your life choices. "You got the dump, Trav," she said, barely containing her glee. "The old falling-apart farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Should have taken better care of him. Maybe you would have gotten something actually valuable." Tiffany joined in, giggling behind her hand. "Oh my God, that place is a disaster. The roof leaks, the plumbing is from like the Civil War era, and I'm pretty sure there are raccoons living in the attic. Dad used to joke about tearing it down." "At least you got something," Lauren added with fake sympathy, finally looking up from her phone. "I mean, it's not $12 million in stock, but you could probably sell it for like what, 50 grand? Maybe 75 if you find someone really desperate." They were laughing now, all three of them, feeding off each other's cruelty like hyenas who just found wounded prey. Melissa was wiping tears from her eyes, her mascara smudging slightly. "This is perfect. This is actually perfect. The handyman gets the handyman special. It's so poetic." I sat there absorbing their mockery, feeling my face get hot, but keeping my expression neutral. I'd learned a long time ago that the best response to the Hawthorne sisters when they got like this was to give them nothing. No reaction, no ammunition, just let them exhaust themselves on their own superiority complex. But Mr. Henderson wasn't laughing. In fact, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and what might have been respect. He cleared his throat loudly, professionally, cutting through their cackling like a judge's gavel. "Actually," he said, his voice suddenly sharp enough to slice through their celebration like a hot knife through their designer egos. "There's more." The laughter stopped immediately. All three sisters turned to look at him, their smiles faltering like someone had just announced the store was out of their favorite Roy flavor. "What do you mean more?" Melissa asked, her voice tight. Mr. Henderson reached into his folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. It was cream-colored, expensive-looking paper, and across the front in Richard's distinctive shaky handwriting was my name. Travis Michael Donovan. "Your father requested that Travis read this privately," Henderson said, sliding the envelope across the Polish table toward me. "It contains additional instructions regarding his bequest." I picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it, the thickness suggesting multiple pages inside. Through the paper, I could feel something small and metal. A key maybe. Melissa's smile had completely vanished now, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "What kind of additional instructions?" "Charles, we have a right to know what's in our father's will." "You know everything that pertains to you," Henderson replied calmly. "This is a private communication between Mr. Hawthorne and his son-in-law. Perfectly legal, I assure you." I pocketed the envelope, feeling all three sisters' eyes boring into me like laser beams of suspicion and barely contained rage. Melissa leaned toward me, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow sounded more threatening than if she'd yelled. "Don't get too excited, Travis. It's probably instructions on how to maintain that piece of crap property. Or maybe the code to his antique tractor. Dad always did have a weird sense of humor about worthless things." I looked at her, really looked at her and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small one, the kind that says, "I know something you don't, and it's killing you." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Maybe it runs on karma." She didn't laugh. None of them did. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something close to hope. I waited until I was in my truck before opening the envelope because there was no way in hell I was giving Melissa and her designer-clad vulture sisters the satisfaction of watching me read whatever Richard had left me. The parking garage under Henderson and Blaze building was one of those underground concrete mazes that smelled like oil and expensive regret. The kind of place where every sound echoes and makes you feel like you're in a movie about corporate espionage. My truck, a 2015 Ford F1-150 that had seen better days and about 47 different construction sites, looked ridiculously out of place among the Teslas and BMWs, like a working-class hero at a yacht club mixer. I sat there in the driver's seat, engine off, just holding this envelope and feeling the weight of it. The paper was thick, the kind you buy from specialty stores where they ask if you want it hand-pressed or whatever pretentious thing makes paper cost $30 a sheet. Richard's handwriting on the front was shaky but deliberate. My name written with the careful precision of someone who knew these might be some of the last words he'd ever write. My hands were actually trembling a little as I broke the seal, which annoyed me because I'm not typically the trembling type. I build houses for a living. I use power tools that could remove fingers if you sneeze wrong. But something about this moment felt huge, like opening Pandora's box, except hopefully with less unleashing of evil upon humanity, and more finding out why a dying millionaire had given me a farmhouse everyone assumed was worthless. Inside the envelope were three things. A handwritten letter on matching cream stationery, a smaller sealed envelope marked for later, and a brass key that looked old and important. The kind of key that definitely didn't go to anything as mundane as a tractor or a garden shed. It had weight to it, substance, and an ornate design on the handle that looked almost Victorian. I unfolded the letter, and Richard's voice practically jumped off the page. Even his handwriting had attitude. All sharp angles and confident strokes despite the shakiness age and illness had added. Travis, it began because Richard had never been one for dear or any of that sentimental greeting card garbage. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Which means I finally escaped listening to Lauren talk about her brand Synergy or whatever horseshit she's calling it these days. Small mercies. I actually laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls around me. Even from beyond the grave, the old man couldn't resist taking shots at his daughters. The letter continued. If my daughters are laughing right now, and let's be honest, they definitely are. Let them. They think they won. They think they got the empire, the company, the golden ticket to Easy Street. They have no idea what they actually got, but they'll figure it out soon enough. Probably around month 3 when they realize running a textile company requires more than posting pictures on Instagram and attending charity brunches where they pretend to give a damn about literacy or saving the whales or whatever cause is trendy this season. I could picture Richard writing this probably hooked up to oxygen, morphine dripping into his veins, still sharp as a tack and twice as mean. The man had been barely able to walk to the bathroom without assistance. But his mind had stayed clear right up until the end, cataloging every slight, every absence, every fake. I'll visit soon text message his daughters had sent. The farmhouse isn't what it seems, Richard wrote. And I felt my pulse quicken. 82. Willow Creek Road has been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather built that house with his own hands back in 1924. And every Hawthorne man since has added something to it. My father put in the basement. I added the workshop. But what's under the old cider press in that basement? That's something nobody knows about except me, my accountant, Miriam Lopez, and now you. The old cider press. I remembered it vaguely from the one time Richard had taken me out to the farmhouse about 3 years ago back when he was still healthy and just wanted someone to help him move some furniture. His daughters had deemed too country for their aesthetic. The press had been this massive antique thing in the corner of the basement made of wood and iron and looking like a museum piece from the agricultural revolution. We'd moved boxes around it and I'd asked if it still worked. Everything in that house still works, Richard had said. You just have to know how to use it. At the time, I'd figured he was just being philosophical about old stuff, but now that memory hit different. The letter continued. Go to the basement. Move the cider press. It's on wheels. Easier than it looks. Underneath you'll find a trapdoor. The brass key opens it. What's inside is what I couldn't trust anyone else with. Travis, you earned it. You sat with a dying old bastard when everyone else found convenient excuses. You changed my oxygen tanks. You made me terrible soup that I complained about but secretly appreciated. And you treated me like a human being instead of a walking ATM or an obligation you could outsource. My throat felt tight reading that, remembering all those nights sitting with Richard, watching Clint Eastwood movies, and listening to him tell stories about building his company from nothing, about the risks he took, the people who doubted him, the times he almost lost everything and somehow clawed his way back. Inside that envelope marked for later, Richard's letter went on, are instructions for what comes next. Don't open it yet. First, go to the farmhouse. See what I left you. Then, and only then, read those instructions. Trust me on this, kid. The order matters. The letter ended with, they thought I was just a senile old man rambling about the past. They thought all I cared about was the company, the legacy, the Hawthorne name. But here's what they never understood. A legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you leave it with. Make me proud, Travis. And if you get a chance, tell Melissa that Karma's A with a long memory and excellent accounting skills. R.H. I sat there holding this letter, reading it 3 times, feeling emotions I couldn't quite name. Richard had planned this. Every detail, the farmhouse that everyone mocked, the mysterious inheritance, this entire elaborate setup, it was all intentional. The man had orchestrated his final move like a chess grandmaster playing against opponents who didn't even know they were in a game. My phone buzzed. A text from Melissa. Don't get your hopes up about whatever Dad wrote. He was probably medicated and sentimental. The farmhouse is still a dump. Maybe you can flip it and finally afford a decent vacation. Another buzz. Tiffany. Honestly, Travis, you should thank us for not contesting the will. We could have argued you manipulated Dad in his final days. We're being generous. And Lauren, no hard feelings about the inheritance distribution. Dad knew what he was doing. Some people are meant to build empires and some people are meant to maintain old houses. Both are important. Heart emoji, prayer hands emoji, house emoji. The condescension was so thick I could have spread it on toast. They were so convinced they'd won. So absolutely certain that their 12 million in stock was the prize and my farmhouse was the consolation trophy for the loser who'd done all the work. I looked at the brass key in my palm, feeling its weight, its promise of secrets. Then I looked at the smaller sealed envelope marked for later, resisting the urge to rip it open right there in my truck like some impatient kid on Christmas morning. But Richard had said the order mattered. And if there was one thing I'd learned about Richard Hawthorne over the past few months, it was that when he said something mattered, you listened. I started the truck, the engine rumbling to life with that reliable working-class growl that probably offended every luxury vehicle in the garage. As I pulled out into the afternoon sunlight, heading toward the highway that would take me to Willow Creek, my phone buzzed one more time. Melissa, again, by the way, we're having the lawyers draw up papers for us to buy that farmhouse from you. We'll give you $80,000, which is way more than it's worth. Consider it a gift. You could really use the money and we can tear it down and develop the land properly. Win-win. I smiled, pocketing my phone without responding. She had no idea what was waiting under that old cider press, what Richard had really left me, what this was actually all about. But she was about to find out. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see her face when she did. The farmhouse was calling. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something dangerous blooming in my chest. Hope mixed with vindication, anticipation with a healthy dose of you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating the handyman. Karma wasn't just running on schedule anymore. It was about to pay dividends. The drive to Willow Creek took about 45 minutes through suburbs that gradually dissolved into actual countryside. The kind where gas stations become scarce and Dollar General stores are considered major retail developments. The farmhouse sat on 12 acres at the end of a gravel road that hadn't been properly maintained since probably the Clinton administration, surrounded by fields that had gone wild and enough trees to qualify as a small forest. It was the kind of property that real estate agents would describe as rustic and full of potential, which is code for bring a contractor, a priest, and low expectations. I hadn't been out here since Richard got sick, and pulling up to the place hit me with this weird wave of nostalgia mixed with apprehension. The house itself was exactly as everyone described. A 2-story white farmhouse that had definitely seen better decades with a wraparound porch that sagged in places, shutters that hung at angles that defied both physics and any sense of aesthetic harmony, and a roof that looked like it was holding on through sheer stubbornness and possibly spite. The paint was peeling in spots, giving it that haunted by the ghosts of better maintenance decisions vibe that every old farmhouse eventually achieves. But here's the thing nobody understood about this place. Richard had loved it. Not in the way his daughters love their penthouses or luxury cars, but genuinely loved it. He'd told me once during one of our late-night morphine philosophical conversations that this farmhouse represented everything he'd built his empire to escape from and everything he wished he'd never left behind. Progress isn't always forward, Travis, he'd said. Sometimes it's just expensive. I parked in the overgrown driveway, grabbed my flashlight from the truck bed because country properties don't believe in adequate lighting, and headed for the front door. The key Richard had given me months ago still worked. The lock clicking open with that satisfying sound of old mechanisms that were built back when things were made to actually last instead of planned to obsolete in 3 years. Inside, the house smelled like dust, old wood, and memories nobody had bothered to visit. The furniture was covered in white sheets like ghosts of a life Richard had maintained but never really lived in these last few years. The living room had a stone fireplace big enough to roast a small cow, hardwood floors that creaked with character, and windows that looked out over the property with views that probably cost millions in other zip codes, but here just came with mosquitoes and property taxes nobody wanted to pay. I made my way through the house to the basement door, which was hidden in the back of the kitchen behind what looked like a regular pantry, but was actually a false front. Because, of course, Richard had secret passages in his farmhouse. The man couldn't do anything straightforward if his life depended on it. The door swung open with a horror movie creak that would have made any self-respecting ghost proud, revealing wooden stairs that descended into darkness thick enough to cut with a knife. The basement was unfinished. All concrete floors and exposed beams with that particular smell basements have. That's part earth, part mildew, and part something definitely died down here once. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cardboard boxes labeled in Richard's handwriting. Christmas decorations 1987. Tax records. Keep forever apparently. And my personal favorite, Melissa's childhood art. Terrible, but she cried when I tried to throw it out. And there in the far corner, exactly where Richard said it would be, sat the old cider press. It was this massive contraption made of dark wood and iron, probably weighing several hundred pounds, looking like something that belonged in a museum exhibit about agricultural history, titled How Our Ancestors Turned Apples into Alcohol Before They Invented Therapy. I walked over to it, running my hand along the warm wood, and noticed for the first time what I'd missed 3 years ago. Wheels. Heavy-duty industrial caster wheels had been installed on the base, hidden by the shadows, and deliberately positioned to look like they were just part of the original structure, but these were new, modern, probably rated for serious weight. Richard had modified this thing specifically to be moved. I pushed and the cider press rolled aside easier than I expected, smooth and silent like it had been oiled recently, which it probably had been. Knowing Richard and his attention to detail, he'd probably been maintaining this secret right up until he couldn't get out here anymore. Underneath, set into the concrete floor, was a trapdoor, not some old wooden thing you'd expect in a farmhouse basement, but a modern steel door with a brushed metal finish, complete with a keyhole that looked like it belonged on a safe deposit box and a small keypad that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. "You magnificent, sneaky old bastard," I whispered, pulling out the brass key Richard had left me. The key slid into the lock like it was coming home, turning with a solid click that echoed in the basement. But the door didn't open. The keypad blinked, waiting for a code. Of course, there was a code. Richard wasn't about to make this too easy, even from beyond the grave. I stood there thinking, my mind racing through possibilities. Richard's birthday, too obvious. The company's founding date, maybe, but that felt too corporate for something this personal. Then it hit me. The date Richard had taken me to the farmhouse the first time, the day he'd shown me around and told me about his grandfather building this place with his own hands. It had been his father's birthday, October 7, 1924. I typed in October 7, 1924. The keypad beeped once, turned green, and the steel door clicked open with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a bank vault in a heist movie. I pulled the door up, revealing a ladder descending about 8 feet into what looked like a small concrete room. LED lights flickered on automatically as I climbed down, motion activated, illuminating a space about 10 feet by 10 feet that looked like it had been carved out and poured specifically for this purpose. The walls were lined with metal shelving, and sitting on those shelves were plastic storage containers, filing boxes, and a small safe built directly into the concrete wall. My hands were shaking again as I opened the first container. Inside were legal documents, dozens of them, all organized with colored tabs and labels in Richard's meticulous handwriting. I pulled out the first folder and the label made my heart stop. Hawthorne Holdings, Private Assets. Travis Michael Donovan, Managing Director. Managing Director. Me, Travis, Mr. Average Donovan, the guy who fixed garbage disposals at family gatherings and got introduced as the handyman with no ambition. I opened the folder with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. Inside were incorporation papers for something called Willow Creek Holdings LLC, established 6 years ago with me listed as the managing director and sole beneficiary upon Richard's death. There were stock certificates, real estate deeds, offshore account information with banks I'd only heard about in movies about international espionage, and investment portfolios that made my eyes water. I grabbed another folder. This one was labeled Liquid Assets Transfer Complete. March 14th. The date was 1 day before Richard had updated his will, right before he'd call me to come over and help him organize some paperwork. I thought we were just filing old tax returns. Turns out we were orchestrating the financial equivalent of a magic trick where the rabbit disappears from one hat and shows up in another, except the rabbit was $9.4 million. $9.4 million. I had to sit down on the concrete floor because my legs just quit working. The number was right there in black and white, printed on official bank statements, verified by Miriam Lopez's signature as the accountant of record, dated and notarized, and absolutely, completely mind-blowingly real. While Melissa and her sisters had been fighting over designer handbags and posting filtered selfies about family values, Richard had been quietly liquidating portions of his holdings, moving assets around like a financial chess master, creating this entirely separate entity that nobody knew about except him, his accountant, and apparently now me. There was a letter paper clipped to the bank statements handwritten on the same cream stationery as the letter in the car. Travis, surprise. This is what they missed while they were too busy measuring the curtains in their inheritance. I spent 6 years moving money, selling off pieces of the company nobody paid attention to, investing in properties and portfolios that actually made sense instead of just looking good on paper. Willow Creek Holdings owns 17 commercial properties, has investments in 4 different continents, and controls enough liquid assets to make my daughter's $12 million look like pocket change. The company they got, it's a shell, kid. The pretty exterior with nothing but debt and my stubbornness holding it together. You got the heart. Use it wisely. Make something that matters. And when Melissa inevitably calls you crying for money in about 6 months, feel free to remind her that karma keeps excellent receipts. R.H. I sat there in that secret underground room surrounded by evidence of Richard's final masterpiece. And I laughed. I laughed so hard I scared what sounded like mice or possibly raccoons in the basement above me. I laughed until tears rolled down my face and my stomach hurt and I couldn't breathe right because Richard Hawthorne, the complicated man his daughters had eulogized without knowing. The millionaire everyone thought they understood, had pulled off the most beautiful, vindictive, absolutely perfect con I'd ever seen. He'd given them exactly what they wanted. The company, the prestige, the title of Hawthorne Industries Air Isis. And in doing so, he'd given them nothing but a sinking ship with their names on it. And me, the average handyman, the son-in-law with no ambition, the guy who'd shown up and made terrible soup. I got the empire they didn't even know existed. I climbed out of that secret room, closed the trap door, rolled the cider press back into place, and walked out of the basement into the late afternoon sunlight, feeling like I just discovered I was the protagonist in a story I didn't know I was in. My phone buzzed. Another text from Melissa. Travis, seriously, think about our offer. $80,000 is really generous for that dump. You could pay off your truck. I looked at my phone, then at the farmhouse, then at the 12 acres of worthless property that came with a secret $9 million trust fund and enough investments to make me rethink my entire understanding of wealth. I typed back. I'll think about it. But what I was really thinking was, Richard, you magnificent, devious, absolutely brilliant old man. You really did save the best for last. And somewhere, I swear I could hear him laughing. I called Miriam Lopez at 7:30 the next morning because I'd spent the entire night lying awake in bed staring at my ceiling, my brain doing mathematical gymnastics it wasn't qualified for and coming up with numbers that seemed impossible. Melissa had been snoring next to me, dead to the world, after spending 3 hours on the phone with her sisters planning how they were going to restructure Hawthorne Textiles and maximize shareholder value, which I'm pretty sure meant firing half the staff and buying themselves corner offices with views that cost more than those employees' annual salaries. Miriam's number had been in one of the folders in the secret basement vault written on a business card that was so old school it might as well have been carved on a stone tablet. Miriam Lopez, CPA, when you need someone who actually understands numbers and won't steal your money. That was really her tagline. I loved her already, and we hadn't even spoken. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert like she'd been awake for hours, probably because she had been. Accountants are a different breed. They wake up at 500 a.m. voluntarily, and think recreational spreadsheet organizing is a valid hobby. Travis Donovan, she said before I even introduced myself. I've been waiting for your call. Took you longer than Richard predicted. He said you'd find the vault within 24 hours. It's been 36. Traffic was bad. I said, which was a lie, but also somehow felt true emotionally. She laughed. This sharp bark of amusement that sounded like she'd spent too many years dealing with rich peoples to be surprised by anything anymore. Can you meet me at Rosie's Diner off Highway 42 in an hour? We need to talk and I need to see your face when I explain exactly what you just inherited. It's going to be fun for me. I mean, you're probably going to need several cups of coffee and maybe a paper bag to breathe into. Rosie's Diner was one of those classic American establishments that looked like it hadn't been remodeled since Eisenhower was president and wore that fact like a badge of honor. Red vinyl booth with duct tape holding together the seats, a checkerboard floor that had seen better decades, and a jukebox in the corner that probably still played actual vinyl records if you pumped enough quarters into it. The coffee was served in thick ceramic mugs that could double as weapons in a pinch, and the menu featured things like Trucker Special and the Heart Attack platter with no irony whatsoever. Miriam was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a laptop open, 3 manila folders stacked beside her, and a cup of coffee that looked like it could strip paint. She was in her mid-50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, wearing glasses that hung on a chain around her neck and a blazer that said, "I'm professional, but I will also fight you if necessary." She had the look of someone who'd spent decades watching wealthy people make terrible decisions and had stopped being surprised by human stupidity sometime during the dot bubble. "You must be Travis," she said, looking up from her laptop with eyes that assessed me like I was a tax return. She was auditing for discrepancies. "Sit. Order something. You're going to need calories for this conversation." I slid into the booth across from her just as a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the Carter administration appeared with a coffee pot. Her name tag said, Deb. And she poured my coffee without asking if I wanted any, which is the kind of service I can respect. "What will it be, honey?" Deb asked, her voice carrying that particular rasp of someone who'd smoked a pack a day for 40 years and wasn't about to apologize for it. "Pancakes," I said. Because when your life is imploding in the best possible way, you eat pancakes and bacon. Lots of bacon. "Smart man," Miriam said as Deb walked away. "You're going to need protein and carbs for what I'm about to tell you." She closed her laptop, pushed it aside, and pulled the manila folders in front of her like a dealer about to reveal a winning hand. "So, You found Richard's little treasure trove. How'd that feel? Like I was in a movie, except I'm pretty sure the budget was higher and the plot made more sense, I said, wrapping my hands around the coffee mug. Miriam, what the hell did Richard do? She smiled. And it was the smile of someone who'd been waiting years to watch this particular bomb go off. What Richard did, Travis, was spend the last 6 years of his life orchestrating the most beautiful screw you to his daughters that I've ever witnessed in 30 years of accounting for wealthy families. And trust me, I've seen some impressive family warfare. Once watched a guy leave his entire estate to his cat just to spite his kids. But Richard was playing a different game entirely. She opened the first folder, spinning it around so I could see the contents. It was a timeline meticulously documented, showing asset transfers dating back 6 years. Richard came to me in 2019, Miriam explained, her finger tracing down the dates. Said he wanted to restructure his holdings because he didn't trust his daughters to manage real wealth. They were already fighting over designer clothes and country club memberships, and the company was still running fine with him at the helm. He could see the writing on the wall. When he died, they'd tear everything apart, fighting over scraps and status. So, he started moving money, I said, scanning the documents. Not just moving it, transforming it. Richard was brilliant, Travis. Most people think textile manufacturing in America is dead, right? Outsourced to Bangladesh and Vietnam, race to the bottom, all that depressing economic reality. And on the surface, that's exactly what Hawthorne Textiles looked like. A struggling legacy company barely holding on through Richard's sheer stubbornness and some loyal contracts he'd maintained through relationships built over 40 years. She pulled out another folder, this one thicker, but what nobody knew. Not his daughters, not the board, not even most of his employees, was that Richard had been quietly selling off the profitable parts of the company piece by piece. He'd identify a division that was actually making money, spin it off into a separate entity under Willow Creek Holdings and replace it with debt and underperforming assets back in the main company. Like performing surgery on a business, removing all the healthy organs, and leaving behind a pretty corpse that looked fine from the outside, but was basically running on fumes and inherited reputation. My pancakes arrived, and I forgot they existed. So, the company the girls got is a beautiful, prestigious shell worth about $12 million on paper, but actually carrying $8 million in debt that's structured to come due over the next 3 years. They got the Hawthorne name, the headquarters building, which is mortgaged to hell, some equipment that's outdated, contracts that are barely profitable, and a workforce that's going to need massive restructuring to stay solvent. In short, they got a full-time job that pays terribly and comes with a ticking time bomb of financial obligations. And I got the empire's heart, Miriam said, leaning back with satisfaction. 17 commercial properties generating passive income across 3 states. A minority stake in a Vietnamese textile manufacturer that's actually killing it. Richard got in early, by the way, before it was cool. Investments in sustainable farming operations, tech startups focused on fabric innovation, even a small but growing online custom clothing platform that's positioned perfectly for the next decade of retail, plus the liquid assets. $9.4 million in diversified portfolios that survived the 2020 market crash beautifully because Richard was paranoid and smart about risk management. I finally took a bite of pancakes, but they tasted like cardboard because my brain was too busy exploding. Why me? I asked. I'm a contractor. I build decks and renovate kitchens. I have no business managing millions of dollars. Miriam smiled softer this time. That's exactly why he chose you, Travis. You're not blinded by the money because you didn't grow up with it. You understand the value of work because you've actually done it. And more importantly, you showed up. You sat with a dying man, changed his oxygen tanks, made him terrible soup that he complained about but ate anyway because it came from someone who actually gave a damn. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine, her grip firm and warm. Richard told me about you, Travis, about how you'd tell him jokes to distract him from the pain. How you'd watch those old westerns with him even though you probably thought they were boring as hell. How you treated him like a person instead of an ATM or an obligation. He said, you were the only one who saw him as Richard instead of as Richard Hawthorne, textile magnate. My throat felt tight. I just didn't want him to die alone. And that, Miriam said, squeezing my hand once before pulling back, is exactly why you're sitting here with a $9 million trust fund, and they're sitting with a company that's about to teach them very expensive lessons about what real work actually looks like. Richard didn't just give you money, Travis. He gave you opportunity. The question is, what are you going to do with it? I looked down at the folders, at the documentation of Richard's years-long plan, at the evidence that someone had believed in me more than I'd ever believed in myself. I have no idea, I admitted. Good, Miriam said, raising her coffee mug in a toast. That's the first step to not screwing it up. The second step is hiring me to continue managing your accounts because, honey, you seem like a good guy, but I wouldn't trust you to balance a checkbook without adult supervision. I laughed, actually laughed, and clicked my mug against hers. Deal. But I have one question. Shoot. Does Melissa know any of this yet? Miriam's smile turned absolutely wicked. Oh, Travis. The trust became public record yesterday when it was officially transferred to you. So, she knows you got something more than a farmhouse. She just doesn't know exactly what yet, but she will. Very, very soon. How soon? Check your phone. I pulled out my phone and there were 17 missed calls from Melissa, 12 from Tiffany, and 9 from Lauren, plus approximately 47 text messages that I'm pretty sure violated several communication decency laws. Miriam laughed, that sharp bark again. And that, Travis, is what we call reality setting in. Welcome to the empire. Try not to let it go to your head. But it was too late. I was already grinning. I decided to spend the afternoon at the farmhouse after my meeting with Miriam. Partly because I wanted to explore the property with fresh eyes now that I knew it came with a $9 million bonus package, but mostly because I needed somewhere to be when Melissa inevitably figured out what had happened and came looking for blood. The farmhouse seemed like neutral territory, or at least territory where I could see her coming from a distance, and prepare myself emotionally. I'd stopped at a grocery store on the way and picked up the ingredients for lemonade. Real lemonade, not that powder crap from a jar. Because if I was going to face down my wife's inevitable meltdown, I was going to do it while sipping something refreshing and pretending I had my life together. There's something deeply satisfying about making lemonade from scratch when life has just handed you the metaphorical equivalent of a lemon orchard in a sugar factory. I was sitting on the farmhouse's front porch in an old rocking chair I'd found in the barn, watching the sun start its lazy descent toward the horizon and feeling pretty damn philosophical about everything. When I heard the sound of tires on gravel moving way too fast for a residential road, the sound got louder, angrier, like the vehicle itself was pissed off. And then Melissa's white Mercedes SUV came flying around the bend doing at least 50 on a road that suggested 25 if you valued your suspension. She slammed on the brakes hard enough. That gravel sprayed everywhere, creating this dramatic cloud of dust that would have been perfect for a movie entrance. Except this was real life and way more terrifying. The driver's door flew open before the dust even settled. And Melissa emerged wearing designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, heels that had no business being worn on a gravel driveway, and an expression that suggested she was about to commit a felony and felt completely justified about it. "You stole it," she screamed, storming toward the porch with her finger pointed at me like a weapon. "You manipulated him. You poisoned his mind against us. You." She was so angry she couldn't even finish the sentence. Just stood there at the bottom of the porch steps vibrating with rage and expensive perfume. I took a long, slow sip of my lemonade, letting the silence stretch out like taffy, and then calmly said, "Nope. Your dad gave it to me. Maybe because I actually changed his oxygen tanks instead of my outfit every 3 hours." Her face went from red to purple, which I didn't even know was possible on a human being outside of cartoon characters. "Don't you dare act self-righteous with me, Travis. We know what you did. We talked to Charles Henderson and he confirmed that Dad set up some trust fund for you months before he died." While we were grieving, I interrupted, setting my lemonade down on the porch railing. "You were on a work trip in Austin photographing yoga pants. Tiffany was in Seattle finding herself or whatever rich people call avoiding responsibility these days. Lauren was posting thirst traps on Instagram and calling it content creation. I was the one here, Melissa. Me alone doing the actual work of caring for a dying human being. We couldn't handle it emotionally," she shouted. And I swear she actually believed that. Like emotional unavailability was a valid excuse for abandoning your father. "You know, hospitals trigger my anxiety. My therapist said, 'Your therapist doesn't know your dad died thinking his daughters cared more about handbags than him,'" I said quietly, and that landed like a punch. I could see it in her face, the flinch, the moment of doubt before the anger rushed back in to cover it up. Before she could respond, 2 more vehicles pulled up. Tiffany's black Audi and Lauren's red Tesla because of course they'd carpooled their rage. The sisters emerged like a well-dressed mob, their heels clicking on gravel in synchronized fury. "Travis," Tiffany yelled, marching over with her phone already out like she was documenting evidence for a future lawsuit. "We demand to see the documentation for this so-called trust fund. Our lawyers say we have grounds to contest it based on undue influence. Your lawyers are going to charge you about $500 an hour to tell you what I'm about to tell you for free," I said, standing up and leaning against the porch post. "Your dad was completely mentally competent when he set this up. Miriam Lopez, his accountant who's been with him for 30 years, will testify to that. Charles Henderson, the family lawyer you've known since you were kids, will confirm it. You don't have a case. You have hurt feelings and expensive legal bills. Lauren had her phone out, too, filming everything because apparently the girl couldn't experience reality without documenting it for her followers. This is elder abuse, she announced to her phone camera. Her voice taking on that performative quality influencers use when they're pretending to be passionate about something. Financial manipulation of a vulnerable senior citizen. My followers need to know about this. Accountability is important. Perfect, I said, smiling directly at her camera. Make sure you post it with the caption, "How to lose $9 million in 9 months by abandoning your dying father." Really captures the essence of your family values. Very on brand. That stopped her cold. She lowered the phone, her perfectly contoured face scrunching up in confusion. What do you mean 9 million? Charles said it was a trust fund, not Travis. How much did Dad leave you? And there it was, the moment I'd been simultaneously dreading and anticipating since Miriam had laid out the numbers for me at Rosie's diner. I could have been diplomatic about it. I could have softened the blow, been the bigger person, taken the high road. But you know what? Screw the high road. The high road doesn't get you anywhere when you're dealing with people who've spent years treating you like the help. 9.4 million, I said clearly. In liquid assets alone, plus 17 commercial properties, minority stakes in several profitable businesses, and investments across 4 continents. Willow Creek Holdings, I'm the managing director. Your dad spent 6 years building it while you were busy posting about gratitude and manifesting abundance without actually understanding what either of those words meant. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear birds chirping in the trees behind the house. It was like someone had hit pause on reality and forgotten to press play again. Tiffany spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. That's impossible. The company was worth 12 million. We got the company. The math doesn't. The math works fine when you understand your dad gave you a sinking ship with a pretty paint job. I explained, enjoying this way more than I probably should have. Hawthorne Textiles is carrying 8 million in structured debt. He gutted the profitable divisions and moved them under Willow Creek Holdings. You got the name, the prestige, and a whole lot of financial problems that are going to start coming due in about 18 months. Congratulations on your inheritance. Hope you kept the receipts on those celebration outfits. Melissa's legs seemed to give out. She actually sat down on the porch steps, her designer jeans getting dusty, her face blank with shock. He wouldn't do that, she said. But her voice had lost all its conviction. He loved us. He was our father. He did love you, I said. And I meant it. But he loved you enough to teach you a lesson you desperately needed to learn. You can't just show up for the good parts, Melissa. You can't go someone when they're dying and expect to inherit their respect along with their money. Life doesn't work that way. Karma doesn't work that way. Tiffany had her phone to her ear now, probably calling her lawyer, pacing back and forth in the driveway, and hissing about litigation and legal options. Lauren had started crying. Actual tears, which was shocking because I didn't think she was capable of genuine emotion that wasn't curated for social media engagement. We deserve our share, Lauren sobbed, mascara running down her face in black rivers. We're his daughters. We're his blood. You're just the guy who married Melissa. You're nothing. And that right there, that entitled, spoiled, completely lacking in self-awareness statement was exactly why Richard had done what he did. You're right, I said calmly. I'm just the guy who married Melissa. The guy who showed up, the guy who made soup and changed oxygen tanks and watched old westerns at 2 o'clock in the morning because your dad couldn't sleep and was scared of dying alone. I'm nothing special, Lauren. I'm just someone who actually gave a damn. Apparently, that was special enough for Richard. Tiffany stormed back over. Her lawyer apparently not answering because it was Sunday afternoon. And even attorneys who charge by the breath need time off. This isn't over, Travis. We're going to fight this. You're going to waste money you don't have on lawyers who will tell you what I already told you. I interrupted. But hey, it's your financial funeral. I'll send flowers. They'll be nice ones, too, because unlike you, I can actually afford them now. Melissa stood up slowly, dust falling from her jeans, her face a mixture of anger and something that might have been betrayal. I want a divorce, she said quietly. Yeah, I replied, not even surprised. I figured I'll make it easy for you. You can keep the house, the cars, whatever. I don't need any of it. But just so we're clear, Melissa, you're not getting a dime of Richard's money. It's in an ironclad trust that specifically excludes you in the event of divorce. Your dad thought of everything. Even this conversation probably. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Or maybe like she was realizing she'd never actually seen me at all. "You've changed," she said. "No," I corrected her. "I just stopped pretending I was okay with how you treated me." Big difference. The three of them left together, a defeated trio, climbing into their luxury vehicles and pulling away much slower than they'd arrived, leaving behind nothing but dust and the faint smell of expensive perfume that got carried away by the evening breeze. I sat back down in the rocking chair, picked up my lemonade, and took a long drink. It had gotten warm, but it still tasted like victory. The farmhouse creaked around me, settling into the evening, and somewhere in the fields beyond, I heard an owl starting its nightly haunt. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, I felt peaceful. The divorce papers came through in record time, mainly because Melissa wanted out faster than a shopaholic leaving a store that just announced it's going out of business. She signed everything without contesting, probably because her lawyers had explained in very expensive detail that fighting me would cost more than whatever she might win, which was exactly nothing. I kept Richard's trust and the farmhouse. She kept our suburban house that I'd never really liked anyway, her Mercedes, and enough furniture to stage a moderately successful estate sale. We split the marriage assets down the middle like civilized adults who'd stopped pretending we'd ever actually liked each other. And just like that, 8 years of matrimony dissolved faster than my faith in the institution had about 6 years prior. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I sat down with Miriam Lopez and Charles Henderson in what was rapidly becoming my favorite conference room at Henderson and Blay. The small one on the third floor that didn't have pretentious art on the walls and had a coffee maker that actually worked without requiring an engineering degree to operate. We brought in lunch from a local deli because this was going to be a marathon meeting, the kind where you need pastrami sandwiches and actual sustenance to make it through discussions about corporate restructuring and asset management without your brain leaking out your ears. "All right," Miriam said, spreading papers across the table like a general planning a military campaign, which wasn't far off from what we were actually doing. "Let's talk about what you want to do with Willow Creek Holdings, Travis, because right now you've got a collection of assets that are making money, sure, but they're not really doing anything meaningful. They're just existing. Richard built you a foundation, but now you need to decide what kind of house you're building on it." I'd been thinking about this for days, lying awake at night in the farmhouse that was slowly starting to feel like home instead of just a building I'd inherited. Richard had given me resources, yes, but more importantly, he'd given me an opportunity to do something that actually mattered instead of just existing in someone else's shadow. The question was, what did Travis Donovan actually care about? "Sustainable farming," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. "And textile restoration, but the right way." Richard told me once that his grandfather had started the company because he wanted to make clothes that lasted that people could pass down to their kids. Quality over quantity. But then the market changed, fast fashion became a thing, and the company had to adapt or die. Except adapting meant compromising everything his grandfather had built the company on in the first place. Charles Henderson leaned forward, his glasses catching the light. He'd taken off his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and looked more human than I'd ever seen him in his natural lawyer habitat. "You want to go back to that original vision? Make Willow Creek Holdings about quality textiles and sustainable practices." "Not just quality textiles," I said. The idea forming even as I spoke it out loud. "I want to create a model that proves you can make money and do good at the same time. Local textile manufacturing using sustainable materials. Partnering with small farms that are doing things right instead of factory farms that are destroying the environment. Create jobs in communities that actually need them instead of outsourcing everything to the cheapest labor market we can find." I know it sounds idealistic and probably stupid from a pure profit standpoint. It sounds exactly like something Richard would have done if his daughters hadn't pushed him toward maximizing quarterly earnings. Miriam interrupted and she was smiling. "Travis, you have $9 million in liquid assets and 17 income-generating properties. You've got the financial cushion to take risks that most startups can't afford. And more importantly, you've got something even more valuable. You give a damn. That's surprisingly rare in business." Over the next 3 hours, fueled by pastrami sandwiches and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of despair, we mapped out a 5-year plan for Willow Creek Holdings. We'd restructure it into a proper investment firm with a focus on sustainable agriculture and ethical textile production. We'd partner with that Vietnamese manufacturer Richard had invested in early, the one that was already doing things right, and use them as a model for expanding into domestic production. We buy out struggling small farms and convert them to sustainable practices, creating a supply chain that actually made sense both environmentally and economically. Miriam suggested we bring in a consultant who specialized in B Corp certifications, companies that meet rigorous standards of social and environmental performance. Charles recommended we talk to a friend of his who ran a nonprofit focused on rural economic development. Someone who could help us identify communities where our investment could make the biggest impact. I sat there taking notes like I was back in college. Except this time the subject was how to use inherited wealth without turning into the thing you always hated, which definitely wasn't offered at my community college. We should also fix up the farmhouse, I said during a lull in the conversation. Make it the headquarters for Willow Creek Holdings. Nothing fancy, just restore it properly. Solar panels, energy efficient everything. Turn it into a working example of what we're trying to promote. The optics on that are perfect, Charles said, nodding. Billionaire as fancy downtown office runs empire from restored farmhouse. The media will eat it up. I'm not a billionaire. I protested. I've got 9 million, not 900 million. Miriam laughed. Honey, to 99% of America, you're absolutely a billionaire. Embrace it. Use it. Just don't let it turn you into I hired a local contractor, not a big corporate firm, but Jake Morrison, a guy I'd worked with on various projects over the years, who understood the difference between renovation and destruction. Jake showed up to the farmhouse 3 days later with his crew, took one look at the place, and let out a low whistle that contractors reserve for projects that are either going to be really fun or really expensive. Sometimes both. Travis, my man, Jake said, walking around the porch and poking at boards with a professional skepticism that comes from years of discovering problems hiding under pretty facades. This place has good bones, but we're talking a full restoration here. New roof, electrical upgrade, plumbing that doesn't date back to when Truman was president. You sure you want to dump money into it? I'm sure, I said, but I want it done right. Energy efficient, solar panels, the whole sustainable 9 yards. Make it a house that Richard's grandfather would recognize, but wouldn't feel outdated in. Can you do that? Jake grinned. Can I do it, brother? I've been waiting my whole career for a client who actually wants to do things properly instead of whatever's cheapest. When do we start? Yesterday, I said, and his grin got wider. The renovation took 3 months, and watching that farmhouse transform was like watching someone go from barely surviving to actually thriving. New roof with solar panels that made the place look like it was part spaceship, part farmhouse. Windows that were actually energy efficient instead of decorative holes that leaked heat and money. Plumbing that worked on the first try without making sounds like a dying walrus. Fresh paint, not stark white, but a warm cream color that looked like sunshine and optimism had a baby. And on the front porch, Jake installed a custom-built swing made from reclaimed wood that could hold 3 people comfortably or one person having an existential crisis about inherited wealth, which was becoming my new favorite hobby. People in town started noticing Willow Creek wasn't exactly a metropolis. Population hovered around 3,000 on a good day when everyone was home and someone wasn't visiting relatives in the city. So, when someone dumps money into restoring the old Hawthorne farmhouse and starts a business that's creating actual jobs, word spreads faster than gossip at a church potluck. Frank, Richard's old neighbor, stopped by one afternoon while I was sitting on the new porch swing with my laptop, pretending to understand the quarterly reports Miriam had sent over, but mostly just appreciating that I owned a porch swing now. Look at you, Frank said, climbing the porch steps with the careful deliberation of an 83-year-old who'd fallen once and wasn't eager to repeat the experience. The farmer CEO, that's what people are calling you down at the hardware store. Travis Donovan, the contractor who inherited a fortune and didn't immediately turn into a jackass. You're a local legend, son. The farmer CEO, I repeated, testing the phrase out loud. It sounded ridiculous and perfect at the same time. Like a nickname you initially hate but eventually grows on you like moss on a tree. I like that. Sounds way better than Mr. Average. That's what Richard's daughters used to call you? Frank asked, settling into the rocking chair I'd left out specifically for him since he'd started making these visits a regular thing, among other things, I said. Most of which I can't repeat in polite company. Frank chuckled. That raspy laugh of someone who'd smoked for 50 years, quit 30 years ago, and still sounded like he was working through it. You know what Melissa's been calling you lately? Do I want to know? Probably not. But I'm going to tell you anyway because I'm old and don't care about social niceties anymore. She told someone at the grocery store that you're a manipulative con artist who stole her inheritance through elder abuse. Direct quote Cheryl Staff last month trying to cut costs, but it's like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. Word is they're going to file for bankruptcy by end of year. I nodded watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the fields gold and orange. I didn't feel happy about it. Exactly. But I didn't feel guilty either. Richard had given them exactly what they'd asked for, control of the company, and what they did with it was their responsibility, not mine. Richard knew, I said quietly. He knew exactly what would happen. He gave them enough rope and trusted they'd hang themselves with it. Smart man, Frank said. Mean as hell, but smart. We sat there in comfortable silence. 2 men on a porch watching the day end. And I realized this was exactly what I'd been missing in my old life. This peace, this simplicity, this feeling that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The farmer CEO. Yeah, I could live with that. 6 months after the divorce, Hawthorne Textiles Incorporated started imploding like a building in a controlled demolition. Except nobody was controlling anything, and it definitely wasn't going according to plan. Melissa and her sisters had managed to turn their $12 million inheritance into a masterclass on how not to run a business, which would have been impressive if it wasn't so predictable. First, they'd fired the senior management team, people who'd been with the company for decades and actually knew what they were doing because they wanted to bring in fresh perspectives. Those fresh perspectives turned out to be Tiffany's boyfriend, Chad, who they made marketing director despite his only qualification being that he'd once tried to sell NFTs of cats wearing scarves. That venture had failed spectacularly. But apparently, the Hawthorne sisters believed in second chances when it came to unqualified men they found attractive. The financial reports that crossed Miriam's desk, because of course she still had industry connections feeding her gossip, read like a horror story written by someone who'd never heard of budgets. Melissa had renovated the executive offices for $2 million. Lauren had launched a failed influencer marketing campaign that cost $500,000 and generated exactly 0 sales. Tiffany had invested in a revolutionary fabric that turned out to be regular polyester with better branding. The debt Richard had carefully structured to come due started arriving like bills after Christmas. Except instead of credit card statements, it was millions of dollars in loans that nobody had bothered to prepare for. Employees started jumping ship. Clients found other suppliers. The stock price, which had been traded privately among family and investors, plummeted faster than my faith in humanity every time I checked the news. Then came the bankruptcy filing. Chapter 11. Restructuring the whole 9 yards of corporate failure. The headlines wrote themselves: Hawthorne Textiles falls apart under new leadership, and my personal favorite, sisters inherit empire, immediately drive it into ground. My phone rang at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Melissa's name lit up the screen, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Travis, she sobbed, her voice thick with tears and what sounded like expensive wine. Please, I need help. We lost everything. We can start over together, right? We were good once. I looked out at the farmhouse fields, peaceful under moonlight. Melissa, I'm not mad at you, I said calmly. I'm just allergic to stupidity. Then I hung up politely like a gentleman. A year after Richard died, I found myself sitting on the farmhouse porch watching the sunset bleed gold and crimson across fields that had finally been properly cultivated. Willow Creek Holdings was thriving. We'd partnered with 12 local farms, opened a small textile manufacturing facility that employed 60 people from the community, and turned a profit while actually giving a damn about the planet. The farmer CEO thing had stuck, and honestly, I'd stopped fighting it. But success felt hollow without someone to share it with. So, I drove to Oakwood Cemetery that evening, parking near the massive oak tree that shaded Richard's grave. His headstone was simple granite. Nothing ostentatious, just his name and dates with the inscription he'd requested. He showed up. I placed fresh flowers beside it. Wild flowers from the farmhouse property because Richard would have hated expensive florist arrangements, and sat down on the grass like we were having one of our old conversations. You played the long game, old man, I said softly to the headstone. And you won. The girls filed for bankruptcy last month. Melissa's working retail at some boutique, which is ironic considering she used to spend more there monthly than they probably pay her yearly. Tiffany's boyfriend Chad left her for someone with actual money. And Lauren's follower count dropped when people realized she wasn't wealthy anymore. Turns out authenticity doesn't monetize well when you're broke. A breeze rustled through the oak leaves, and I swear it sounded like Richard's raspy laugh. You didn't just leave me money, I continued. You left me purpose, meaning a chance to build something that actually matters instead of just existing in someone else's shadow. The farmhouse is beautiful now. You'd love it. Solar panels, sustainable everything, and that porch swing gets used daily. Sometimes I sit there and imagine you're sitting next to me making sarcastic comments about oatmeal brands and government incompetence. As I stood to leave, evening light caught the headstone inscription, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The inheritance wasn't the money. It wasn't the properties or investments or any of the tangible wealth Richard had transferred. The real inheritance was the lesson. Show up. Be present. Give a damn when it's hard. Build something that outlasts you. I turned toward my truck and I swear I heard his voice on the wind. Told you to hang in there, kid. The fields glowed gold. Birds sang their evening songs. And for the first time in forever, I laughed loud, free, and genuinely happy because karma hadn't just arrived. It had compounded with interest.